She was 9 years old when they sat her in a chair too tall for her feet to reach the floor. She was 9 years old when a room of 700 leather jackets went silent to hear what she would say. She was 9 years old, and she was the only witness who hadn't decided to lie. The room had already reached its verdict before she sat down. 300 pounds of leather, ink, and prison yard silence. Guilty, obviously. Look at him. 40 years of a badge nobody in that courtroom knew he'd worn, sat folded in a drawer, useless, while a town decided who he was from the outside in. What she said next made 700 grown men rise to their feet at once. The fog came down off the Cascades most mornings in October, settling into the flat basin of the Yakima Valley, until the orchards on either side of Old Natchez Highway looked like rows of grey ghosts holding up their arms. Sadie Lindgren pressed her forehead to the cold window of her mother's Subaru and counted mailboxes the way she always did, because counting things made the ride to school go faster, and because her teacher, Mrs. Abernathy, said a mind that counted was a mind that noticed, and Sadie liked being told she noticed things. She was 9 years old, in the 4th grade at Natchez Valley Elementary, and she kept a green spiral notebook in her backpack where she wrote down numbers that mattered to her. How many days until her birthday? How many bushel baskets fit under the awning at the Renshaw fruit stand? How many seconds it took the school bus to empty out in front of the gym doors? How many freckles she'd counted on the back of her own hand during a spelling test she'd finished early. Her mother, Colleen, called it a phase, something Sadie would grow out of the way she'd grown out of narrating her stuffed animals' conversations out loud at the dinner table. Sadie called it paying attention, and she planned on doing it for the rest of her life, whether anyone else thought it was a phase or not. That morning, the 2nd Tuesday of October, a little after 6:50, the fog was thick enough that Colleen ran the wipers just to clear the mist off the windshield, though it wasn't raining. They passed the Renshaw stand first, its hand-painted sign for Honeycrisp and Gala apples ghostly under a single bare bulb, and 70-year-old Opal Renshaw already outside arranging wooden crates before the sun had properly cleared the ridge. Then came the long straightaway where Old Natchez Highway ran flat between orchard rows before curving north toward the elementary school. And it was there, on the straightaway, that Sadie first heard the motorcycle behind them. She twisted around in her booster seat to look. It passed them in a lane of its own, a big Harley-Davidson ridden by a man she'd seen before, wide-shouldered, a grey beard cut close to his jaw, a leather vest with patches sewn thick across the back, a thin white scar through one eyebrow that she'd once asked her mother about and never gotten a real answer to. He rode past the school most weekday mornings around the same time, and most weekday mornings, 2 blocks past the school at Rosalind's Diner, the owner, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Beatrice Lund, watched him coming through the front window and quietly flipped her sign from open to back in 10 minutes until the sound of his engine had faded past. "Who is that?" Sadie asked, though she'd asked before. "One of the motorcycle men," Colleen said, eyes on the road. "Hell's Angels, I think. Don't stare, baby. He waved at me last week. People like that don't wave, Sadie." "He did." I waved back. Colleen didn't answer that. She flicked the blinker for the turn toward the elementary school, and ahead of them, already stopped at the crosswalk with its red lights strobing weakly through the fog, sat the yellow shape of the school bus, doors folded open, releasing a line of children into the mist toward the sidewalk. What happened next took 11 seconds. Sadie would count them later, over and over, in her green notebook and in her sleep, until the number was as familiar to her as her own birthday. A truck came out of the fog behind the motorcycle. A flatbed loaded with wooden apple bins, Faro Trucking stenciled in faded letters on the door, moving too fast for the visibility, moving faster than anyone sane drives past a stopped school bus with its lights going. Its driver, 22-year-old Dustin Faro, had a phone propped against the dash and eyes that flicked down to it and back up half a second too late to register the strobing red lights. The motorcycle rider saw it first. Sadie watched him do something she didn't have a word for yet, a word she would learn later, from a lawyer in a courtroom, and never be able to unlearn. He laid the bike down. He put his own body and 1,100 pounds of steel sideways across the near lane in a wall of sparks and screaming metal, so that when Dustin Farrow's truck finally swerved to avoid what looked like a wreck already happening in front of him, it swerved away from the bus, away from the children on the sidewalk, away from Sadie's mother's little Subaru, and instead took out the corner post of Opal Renshaw's fruit stand and clipped the rear quarter panel of a parked delivery van hard enough to send Opal, who had run toward the noise instead of away from it, down onto the gravel shoulder. Sadie's door was less than 2 feet from where the motorcycle finally stopped sliding. She saw the rider's face for less than a second before her mother's arm closed over her like a second seatbelt, his eyes open, his mouth already forming words, blood at his hairline, one leg bent beneath him in a way legs weren't supposed to bend. Then there was screaming, and the bus driver running, and someone's phone already dialing, and the terrible stillness of Opal Renshaw not getting back up. By the time the first sheriff's cruiser reached the scene, headlights cutting weak cones through the fog, the story of what had happened was already being told a dozen different ways by a dozen different frightened voices. And not one of those voices belonged to the only person who had watched the whole 11 seconds without once looking away. She was 9 years old, and nobody thought to ask her yet. Warren Holt woke up in a hospital bed at Yakima Valley Memorial with a plate in his left leg, 4 cracked ribs, and a sheriff's deputy standing at the foot of the bed instead of a doctor. He was 63 years old, and it was the second time in his life he had opened his eyes to a law enforcement officer looking at him like a problem that needed solving, though the first time he had been wearing the badge himself. "Mr. Holt," said Sheriff Gareth Pell, a heavy-set man with a notepad he hadn't opened yet, "you understand a woman died out there?" "I understand that," Warren said. His voice came out smaller than he meant it to. He had known Opal Renshaw 20 years, had bought apples from her stand every October since he'd moved out to the valley, had once helped her nephew jump a dead battery on Highway 12 in a January sleet storm. "How is that on me?" "Witnesses say you were riding erratic, weaving, that you're the reason that truck went off the road in the first place. Witnesses in the fog, going 60 on their own before the truck hit anything," Warren said, and then stopped, because he recognized the tone in his own voice, the flat, procedural cadence of a man who used to write accident reports for a living, and he knew exactly how that tone would sound, coming out of a man in a leather vest with the Yakima chapter's death's head patch stitched across his back. It would sound like a lie. It would sound like exactly what a guilty man would say. Nobody at Yakima Valley Memorial asked him what he used to do for 28 years before he retired. Nobody asked because nobody thought to ask. And Warren, lying there with a steel plate holding his tibia together, found he didn't have the strength that week to volunteer it. A nurse named Colette came in twice a day to check his leg, and on the second morning she mentioned, almost in passing, that her father had been a state trooper out of the Ellensburg detachment back in the 90s, and that the name Holt sounded familiar to her from somewhere she couldn't place. Warren told her it was a common enough name and let the moment pass. It would have taken him 30 seconds to explain who he used to be. It felt that week like 30 seconds he didn't have the right to spend on himself while Opal Renshaw's funeral was still being planned 2 floors down the valley at Keith and Keith Funeral Home. Deacon came by that evening with a duffel bag of clean clothes and sat in the plastic chair by the window without saying much of anything useful, which was, Warren had learned over 8 years of riding with the man, exactly the kind of company worth having. 3 days later, County Prosecutor Marjorie Kent stood in front of a bank of local news cameras outside the Yakima County Courthouse on North 2nd Street and announced charges of vehicular manslaughter and reckless endangerment against Warren Holt, 63, a member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club's Yakima chapter. She was 41 years old, 3 years into the job, and she had learned early that a clean, fast resolution to a story the public already believed was worth more to her career than a slow, complicated one that made everybody uncomfortable. The public believed the biker had caused the crash. It was, Marjorie told herself, the physics of the thing that mattered, not the leather vest. Though she noticed, standing at that podium, that she had not once mentioned Dustin Farrow's name. She had received a phone call 2 nights earlier from County Commissioner Roland Farrow, Dustin's father and the owner of Farrow Trucking, a man who had donated $11,000 to her last campaign and sat on the courthouse renovation committee with her mother. He had not asked her to do anything so crude as drop charges against his son. He had simply expressed at some length his confidence that she would find the truth, and his certainty that the truth would show his boy had done everything a person could do to avoid a disaster some outlaw biker had started. Dustin Farrow himself said almost nothing to anyone in those first weeks, not to the sheriff's investigators, not to his father's attorney, and not to the friends who stopped calling once the story broke. He sat in his childhood bedroom above the Farrow Trucking office on Fruitvale Boulevard and replayed his own version of those 11 seconds on a loop that never quite matched the version his father kept feeding to the newspapers. And he did not correct it, because correcting it meant saying out loud that he'd been looking down at a phone instead of up at the road, and he was 22 years old and frightened in a way he had no framework for yet. Colleen Lindgren read about the charges in the Yakima Herald-Republic over coffee and felt something in her chest unclench that she hadn't realized was clenched. Someone was being held responsible. She had spent 3 sleepless nights replaying the crash from her angle, a wall of noise, sparks, her daughter's small body under her arm, and the story the newspaper told her fit neatly over the shape of her fear. The reckless biker, the innocent truck driver swerving to avoid him. It made sense of a morning that otherwise made no sense at all. They're saying it was his fault, she told Sadie over dinner, the motorcycle man. Sadie set down her fork. That's not what happened. Sadie, he put his bike down so the truck wouldn't hit the bus. I saw it, I counted it. Baby, it happened so fast, nobody could really see. I saw it. Sadie said again, quieter, and something in her flat, certain 9-year-old voice made Colleen look at her differently for just a second, before the feeling passed, and she told her daughter to finish her green beans. 200 miles east, in a garage outside Wenatchee, Nathaniel Ridley, 66 years old, road captain of the Yakima chapter and a man everyone in the club simply called Deacon, got the phone call about Warren's arrest and spent that night making calls of his own. By the following weekend, motorcycles had begun arriving in the Yakima Valley from chapters in 5 states, parking in long, silent rows outside the Motel 6 on North 1st Street and the diner lots along Fruitvale Boulevard, not to cause trouble, Deacon told anyone who asked, but because a brother of 41 years was being tried for a dead woman's death based on nothing but the way he looked, and the club intended to be present for every single day of it. It was Deacon who found the folded county citation in the bottom of Warren's saddlebag while collecting his things from the impound lot. Not a citation Warren had received, but one he'd once issued, decades old. Its carbon copy ink faded to brown, signed in a young man's careful hand, Trooper W. Holt, Washington State Patrol. Deacon stared at it a long moment before he folded it back up and put it in his own coat pocket, the way a man keeps something he isn't sure yet what to do with. By the time jury selection began in November, the town of Natchez had already convicted Warren Holt twice over. Once for the crash and once simply for having ridden through it wearing the wrong clothes. The motel parking lots along North 1st Street filled up first, then the diner lots, then the gravel shoulders of Fruitvale Boulevard, until by the second week of November there were more motorcycles parked between the Yakima County Courthouse and the Chinook Motor Inn than most residents had ever seen in one place in their lives. Local news put the number at 700 and climbing. Deacon Ridley, standing in the cold outside the courthouse steps each morning organizing the riders into orderly rows, corrected reporters who called it a show of force. "It's a show of who's still standing behind him," he told a camera crew from Kima. "There's a difference, and I'd appreciate you printing it." Colleen Lindgren drove Sadie past those rows of motorcycles on the way to school every morning that week, gripping the wheel a little tighter each time, telling herself it was reasonable to be afraid of 700 strangers in leather vests occupying her small-town streets, and telling herself, less convincingly each day, that it had nothing to do with what her daughter kept insisting she'd seen. "I want to tell them what happened," Sadie said one night, sitting on the edge of her bed while Colleen tucked the blanket around her. "Tell who, baby?" "The judge, the lawyers, everybody. Sweetheart, you're 9. It was foggy, and it happened so fast, and grown-ups sometimes remember things differently than they actually were, especially when they're scared." Colleen said it gently, and she believed it when she said it, because believing it meant she didn't have to sit with the alternative, that her own memory of that morning, shaped by panic and a slamming heart, might be less reliable than her daughter's had been. "I'm not scared of remembering," Sadie said. "I'm scared of nobody asking." Marion Stiles, the public defender assigned to Warren's case, was 38 years old, 4 years out of a public interest fellowship, and had never handled a case with this much attention on it in her life. She met with Warren in a cinder-block room at the county jail with a legal pad and a folder that felt thin compared to the county's, and she told him plainly what she was up against. A dead woman the whole town had loved, a driver's family with money and a seat on the courthouse committee, and a jury pool that had already decided before hearing a word of testimony what kind of man wore that vest. "There were witnesses at the scene," Warren said. "People who saw the truck cross the line first. 2 witnesses. Both admit the visibility was near zero, and both were behind the truck, not ahead of it. The prosecution's expert says your riding pattern in the seconds before impact is consistent with intoxication or reckless operation." "I hadn't had a drink in 11 years, Warren said, "and that riding pattern is called a lay-down maneuver. It's what you do when the alternative is a truck hitting a school bus full of kids." Marion looked up from her legal pad. "How do you know that term?" Warren was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that had become a habit over the past 8 years, ever since he'd turned in his badge and told himself the uniform was a chapter of his life that was finished, filed away, no longer relevant to the man who rode, with the Yakima chapter on Sunday mornings, for the coffee and the company, and the particular kind of peace that came from being around men who didn't ask him to explain himself. "I used to write those reports," he said finally. 28 years. Washington State Patrol, Traffic Homicide Investigation Unit. I retired in 2018. Marion set her pen down. "Warren, why haven't you told anyone that?" "Because the last time being a cop mattered more to people than what actually happened to a car full of my family. It cost me the one thing I couldn't get back," Warren said, and didn't explain further. And Marion, watching his face close over like a door, decided not to push it that day. The trial began on a Monday, in the second week of November, in Yakima County Superior Court, Judge Harriet Blankenship presiding, a courtroom built to hold perhaps 90 spectators now packed to its walls, with motorcycle club members standing 3 deep along the back, silent, arms crossed, waiting. 2 days in, with the prosecution's accident scene witnesses delivering testimony that grew shakier under cross-examination. One admitted she'd been looking at her own dashboard clock, not the road, in the second before impact. Marjorie Kent felt her clean, fast case beginning to fray at the edges. She had Dustin Farrow's phone records, subpoenaed, and sitting in a folder she had not yet decided whether she needed, showing a text message sent at 6:51 a.m. that Tuesday, 1 minute before the crash. She told herself she would introduce it if she had to. She told herself the case didn't need it yet. That was the moment Warren nearly told Marion to take the deal the prosecution had quietly offered. 18 months, reduced charges, no trial, no more of Deacon's brothers standing in the cold on his account. He had buried a wife 9 years earlier in a different courtroom over a different crash, and had learned that fighting a story people had already decided to believe cost more than it was worth. "Take the deal," he told Marion on Wednesday evening in the jail's visiting room, hands flat on the table. "Opal Renshaw is dead either way. Let the town have its story." "Sadie Lindgren wants to testify," Marion said. Warren looked up. "Her mother's fought it for a month. Says she's too young. Says it's too much for a 9-year-old to sit through, and I understand that. But her teacher called our office yesterday because Sadie's been telling her the same details, unprompted, for 6 weeks straight, including the exact sequence of the bus doors closing before the truck came into view, which isn't something anyone's released publicly. It's in the accident file. Which means either she's the most consistent liar I've encountered in a 9-year-old, or she's telling the truth, and nobody with the power to act on it has been willing to sit her down and listen." Warren was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Don't take the deal." Colleen Lindgren stood in her kitchen that same Wednesday night, holding a subpoena for her daughter's testimony and feeling something close to panic. She had spent a month telling herself Sadie's version of events was a child's confused memory, smoothed over by repetition, easier to believe than the alternative. That Colleen herself, in the chaos of that morning, had gotten it wrong, had let a stranger's leather vest and prison tattoos do her thinking for her before her own eyes had finished processing what happened. She thought about the bus. She thought about how close it had been. She thought about the man's face in that half-second before her arms swept over her daughter, eyes wide open, already trying to say something, already trying to warn them. At 11 that night, she sat down across from Sadie at the kitchen table, took her daughter's hand and said, "Tell me again. Everything slow." Sadie told her again, slow. All 11 seconds of it in order, the way she'd counted it in her green notebook 60 times since October. When she finished, Colleen didn't say anything for a long while. Then she said, "I think I need to go to court tomorrow and fix something I said to the sheriff." The Yakima County Superior Court reconvened at 9:15 on Thursday morning, the 14th of November, under a hard, clear sky that had finally burned off a month of fog, and by 10:40 the gallery had gone as still as Deacon Ridley had ever seen 700 grown men manage to be at once. Outside on North 2nd Street, the rows of motorcycles stretched 3 full blocks, engines silent, riders standing beside them in a cold that had turned their breath to visible clouds, waiting the way people wait outside a hospital rather than a courthouse. Inside, Judge Blankenship had given up trying to seat any more spectators by 9 that morning, and the bailiffs had started turning reporters away at the door by 10:15. Marion Stiles stood at the defense table, rereading her notes for a testimony she had rehearsed with a 9-year-old exactly once the day before, at the Lindgren kitchen table, because Colleen had finally, fully, stopped standing in the way. Sadie Lindgren was called to the stand at 10:47 a.m. She was small in the witness chair, her feet a foot short of the floor, a court officer sliding a wooden box under them so she could sit without her legs dangling. Judge Blankenship leaned forward and asked gently whether she understood the difference between telling the truth and telling a story. And Sadie said yes, and explained, unprompted, that a story was something you made up to be interesting, and the truth was just what happened, and she had never once in her life found it necessary to make anything more interesting than it already was. Marion Stiles walked her through it slowly. The fog, the bus doors, the sound of the motorcycle passing them on the straightaway, the truck emerging out of the mist behind it, faster than it should have been going. The exact moment, Sadie held up 9 fingers, put 2 down, said, "Here," with the flat certainty of a child reciting multiplication tables, that the motorcycle crossed into the near lane ahead of the truck, not weaving, not erratic, but deliberate. A single, clean motion, laying the bike down sideways to fill the space the truck was about to occupy. "How do you know it was deliberate?" Marion asked. "You were 9 years old in a moving car. Could it have simply been an accident, the rider losing control?" "He looked at the truck first," Sadie said. "Then he looked at the bus. Then he did it. People don't look around like that right before they lose control. I've fallen off my bike plenty of times. You don't have time to look at two different things first." A ripple went through the gallery. Not laughter. Something closer to held breath finally released. Marjorie Kent, on cross-examination, pressed harder than she had planned to that morning, asking Sadie whether her mother had coached her, whether weeks of retelling the story had shaped what she remembered into what she wished had happened, whether a 9-year-old could really be trusted to reconstruct 11 seconds of chaos in a fog with any accuracy at all. "I have a notebook," Sadie said. "I wrote it down the same night before anybody told me any different version. You can look at it. I still have it. I brought it." She reached into the small backpack at her feet, unasked, and set the green spiral notebook on the rail of the witness stand, open to a page dated the 2nd Tuesday of October, 11 numbered lines in a careful 9-year-old's handwriting, each one matching, almost word for word, what she had just told the court. It was Colleen who stood next, called by the defense, and testified, voice shaking, hands gripping the rail, that she had told Sheriff Pell in the confusion of that first morning that the motorcycle seemed to cause it, a statement she now wished to correct under oath, because fear and a bad angle and a lifetime of assumptions about men who looked like Warren Holt had done her thinking for her in a moment when her daughter's eyes had already seen clearly. She looked once directly at Warren as she said it, and something passed between them that the transcript would never capture. An apology. Accepted. It was the phone records, introduced that afternoon finally by a prosecutor who had run out of story to tell without them, that closed the physical case. A text message sent from Dustin Farrow's phone at 6:51 a.m. 59 seconds before impact, and the truck's own event data recorder showing no braking input until 6:52 and 11 seconds consistent down to the second, with a 9-year-old's green notebook. And it was Warren Holt's own service record, entered by Marion Stiles over the prosecution's objection, that finally told the courtroom who had been sitting among them in leather and silence for 2 weeks. Trooper First Class Warren Holt, Washington State Patrol Traffic Homicide Investigation Unit, 28 years of service, over 400 fatal collision reports authored, retired with commendation in 2018. Before that, Sergeant Warren Holt, United States Army Military Police, deployed to Panama in December of 1989 during Operation Just Cause. Decorated for calm conduct under fire in the streets of Panama City at 26 years old. A man who had spent his whole working life learning to read exactly the kind of 11 seconds that had just cost Opal Renshaw her life, and who had never once, in 8 years of riding with the Yakima chapter, mentioned it to a single person outside his own kitchen. At 3:52 that Thursday afternoon, the jury retired. They returned in 90 minutes with a verdict of not guilty on all counts. 700 men rose to their feet at once, and the sound of it, not cheering, just standing, boots and folding chairs and long exhaled breath, was the loudest silence Deacon Ridley said he'd ever heard in his life. Hollis Renshaw, 74 years old, Opal's husband of 49 years, had sat through every day of the trial in the second row. A folded flag from his own service, still displayed on the mantel at home, from a war nobody in that courtroom had thought to ask him about either. He waited until the gallery had mostly cleared, until Warren stood alone by the defense table, gathering the weight of 8 years back onto his shoulders, and he walked over on legs that had grown unsteady since his wife's funeral and put out his hand. "I watched this whole town decide who you were the morning we lost Opal," Hollis said, "before a single fact was in. leather and ink and a scar, and everybody had you tried and sentenced by breakfast. That's not judgment. That's just laziness wearing judgment's coat. He held Warren's hand a moment longer. My wife ran toward the noise, instead of away from it because she thought somebody needed help. Don't let this town's laziness be the last word on what she believed people were capable of, yours included. Warren didn't trust his voice enough to answer. He nodded instead, and Hollis nodded back, and that was the whole of it. Two old men who understood better than anyone else, left standing on that courthouse lawn, that some apologies arrived too late to undo anything and get offered anyway, because offering them is still the right thing to do. The charges dismissed. The reporters gone within a week. 700 motorcycles pulled out of the Yakima Valley in a long, unhurried convoy the following Saturday morning, chapter by chapter, state by state, until the motel lots along North First Street stood empty again, and the town could hear itself think. Sheriff Gareth Pell drove out to the impound lot himself that same week to personally release what remained of Warren's Harley into Deacon's flatbed trailer, and he stood there a moment afterward with his hands in his pockets before saying, in a voice that cost him something, that he'd judged the case the way the town wanted it judged before he'd finished collecting the evidence. And that wasn't police work, it was just agreeing with a crowd faster than usual. Warren told him most men never got around to saying that part out loud. Pell said he'd noticed. Old Nature's highway settled back into its ordinary rhythm of school buses and orchard trucks, and fog that came down off the Cascades most October mornings, same as it always had, though the county had installed new flashing beacons at the crosswalk by December, paid for in part by an anonymous donation that Deacon Ridley, if pressed, would neither confirm nor deny, came from 700 riders passing a boot around a Motel 6 parking lot. Warren Holt's leg healed slower than the doctors promised and faster than he expected. By January, he was walking the aisles of the county's new road safety program without a cane, a volunteer position the Washington State Patrol had quietly, almost sheepishly, offered him once the verdict made the newspapers, a chance to teach teenage drivers at the high school gym on Tuesday evenings exactly what 11 seconds of fog could take from a person if you weren't paying attention to it. He never once wore the vest to those sessions. He didn't need to anymore. On the first Tuesday of the new semester, a junior in the front row raised his hand and asked Warren, flat out, if it was true he used to be a cop, and if it was true he was also the biker who got arrested for that crash out on Old Nature's highway, and how a person was supposed to be both those things at once. Warren thought about it longer than the question probably warranted for a room full of 16-year-olds waiting to get to the part about parallel parking. Most people are more than one thing, he finally said. The trouble isn't being more than one thing. The trouble is everybody else only having time to look at whichever one is easiest to judge from across a parking lot. Nobody in the gym had a follow-up question for that, but he noticed over the following weeks that fewer of them looked away when he pulled his motorcycle into the space by the gym doors. Sadie Lindgren turned 10 in December, and her mother let her invite exactly 4 friends, and at Sadie's insistence, 1 motorcycle. Warren idled up the Lindgren driveway at 4 in the afternoon with a bakery box strapped to the sissy bar, and Colleen, watching from the porch, found she no longer had to talk herself into not being afraid. Sadie made him sign her green notebook on a fresh page under a new list she'd started that read, Things I Was Right About, and he signed it Trooper W. Holt, Ret, because she'd asked for his whole name, the real one, the one the newspapers had finally printed correctly. Hollis Renshaw kept the fruit stand open through that winter with his nephew's help. Fewer crates most mornings than Opal used to manage, but the same hand-painted sign. And some Tuesdays, Warren stopped his bike there before the diner, not for apples so much as 15 minutes of standing in the cold with a man who understood exactly how long grief took to loosen its grip. Hollis never brought up the trial again after that first handshake outside the courthouse. He didn't need to. He'd said what needed saying once, and men who'd spent their lives doing hard, careful work understood that some things only need saying once to be true forever. Sadie Lindgren went back to being 9 mostly, then turned 10 mostly. She still kept the green notebook, though the numbers in it had gone back to ordinary things. Days until her birthday, inches of snow on the Chinook Pass webcam, the batting average of the Yakima Valley Pippins shortstop. Reporters had asked to interview her 3 times over the winter, and Colleen had said no every time, because her daughter had already told the truth to the only room that had needed to hear it, and she didn't owe anyone a repeat performance, least of all a camera crew looking for a tidier ending than the one her family had actually lived through. Mrs. Abernathy kept Sadie's old spelling tests and counting exercises in a folder long after that school year ended, not because the district required it, but because she liked to tell new students, the ones who fidgeted through math and got in trouble for talking too much, that the most useful thing a person could be was the kind of noticer nobody thought to ask. She never used Sadie's name when she said it. She didn't need to. Word travels in a town that size, and half the 4th grade already knew exactly who their teacher meant. Colleen drove her to school every morning still, past the spot on the straightaway where the flashing beacons now blinked yellow through whatever weather the valley offered that day, and some mornings, when the motorcycle passed them going the other direction, she no longer told her daughter not to stare. Some mornings, she rolled her own window down first, just enough to lift a hand in greeting before Sadie could beat her to it, and told herself that was simply good manners, not an apology still working itself out one small gesture at a time. On a cold Tuesday in late January, 3 months to the day since the crash, Warren rode his repaired Harley, new fork, same faded paint, Deacon had insisted on that, down Old Natchez Highway past the school, past the Renshaw stand where Hollis now ran things alone with a nephew's help most mornings, and on toward Rosalind's diner for the coffee he'd been buying there twice a week for 11 years without once being allowed to drink it inside. Beatrice Lund heard the engine coming the way she always did, the sound distinct from any other vehicle on that road, and her hand went automatically toward the sign in the window, the way it had every weekday morning for years. It stopped an inch from the glass. She watched him pull into the gravel lot, cut the engine, unfold himself slowly off the seat with the small hitch in his gait the doctors said might never fully leave him, and she turned the sign back around. Open, same as it had said the whole time, same as it always would from here forward, and by the time the little bell over the door rang, she already had his coffee poured, black, no sugar, the way he'd always ordered it through a takeout window he would never have to use again.